África y Asia. Asimismo, Jonathan ha sido académico visitante de la Universidad de Jawaharlal Nehru en Delhi, en la India, en el Instituto de Desarrollo Gerencial de Gurgaon, en la India, así como fue profesor visitante en la Escuela de Negocios de Copenhague y también es profesor visitante en la Universidad de Witwatersrand, en South. Además de las numerosas publicaciones y revistas académicas donde ha abordado de manera magistral los temas que hoy nos ocupan, y de hecho el tema que nos ocupa hoy en día es el tema del ciclo legislativo, del legislative cycle, es decir, entender la legislación como un proceso cíclico que empieza desde el Parlamento y obviamente aterriza, entre comillas, en el ámbito de los otros poderes, díganse poderes ejecutivos, no olvides el poder judicial en su caso, para después regresar en la forma de evaluación y tomas, obviamente, de decisiones para su corrección al poder legislativo. Entonces, en el ámbito de las publicaciones, ¿no? Jonathan es autor de The World Bank Global Managerialism, perdón, de 2008, coautor de Organization Theory and Design en 2010, y coeditor de Getting Things Done, Dialogues, en Estudios Críticos de Gestión. Pero tengo el gusto, ¿no? Y es ahora de presentarle el doctor Jonathan Martin.
Hola, buenos días. Quería decirles, por favor, que contamos con diagramas de traducción para que se las hacen llegar, y también tenemos para nuestras personas que están en línea siguiéndonos las herramientas de subtítulos vía Webex en un icono que tienen a la mano izquierda abajo en su pantalla para que lo activen y puedan ver los subtítulos. Gracias.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me well. Yes? Okay.
Yes, very well, very well. We hear you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for this very kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to participate in this extremely interesting event. I'm very honored. I would like to express my thanks to the senators, the Senate of Mexico, to all of the partners who are involved in putting on this important event. And I hope that the comments I'm going to make will be helpful in contributing to the agenda, the very exciting agenda that you have established. I'm going to make a presentation sharing the screen, and hopefully this works, so we'll see.
Perfect. We will see it.
Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to talk about towards parliamentary full cycle engagement in the legislative process, innovations and challenges. This is an updated presentation based on an article I published in the Journal of Legislative Studies in the year 2000, and which I've updated to take into account the very many developments that have been subsequent to that. To start off, I'd like to just make some points in regard to the context of the full cycle approach to parliamentary work. And this is really a very broadly believed hypothesis that legislatures around the world, excuse me, are getting less powerful. So that although parliaments are a core pillar of contemporary representative democracy, and in fact there is no democratic system today existing without an effective parliament, there is a common scholarly claim that parliaments are getting weaker. And I think a lot of the reason for this claim is the perspective, it comes from what is a valid conclusion, which is that there is strong evidence overall, internationally, across the world, of democratic backsliding. So overall, around the world, the quality of democracy is declining. But of course, that doesn't mean that the quality of parliaments is declining. There are many different factors involved. And I'll be arguing in this paper that there's extremely strong evidence that overall parliaments are playing a stronger role in democratic governance, and one aspect of which is parliament's increasing engagement throughout the legislative cycle. If you, for some reason, my presentation puts number 1 as the third bullet, but an outline of the presentation I'm going to make. The first one is to talk about the context, the renewed thinking about parliamentary democracy over the past decades. The second regards implementation of a full cycle approach. So from a traditional approach in which Parliament is involved in only very specific parts of the policy process, or the democratic process, if we want to be broader, towards a full cycle approach. Thirdly, some of the components, the newer components of a full cycle approach. And fourthly, some cautions, some limitations regarding the full cycle approach. So first of all, talking about renewed thinking about parliamentary democracy. And here I refer particularly to the work of Kari Palonen, who's at Jyväskylä University, where I'm also a visiting professor, and Nadia Urbinati, a very well-known political scientist. Both of them underline the dual role of parliaments as the unique place as institutions, formal state institutions of both inclusive deliberation and democratic decision-making. So deliberation and decision-making. No other institution, whether government or civil society, is capable of performing these interconnected roles that are at the heart of democratic governance. And I'll quote from Nadia Urbinati, 2016, who said, "Diarchic proceduralism accounts for the circularity of communication between the inside and the outside of state institutions, government and society, decision and opinion. It conceives of democracy as a way of dealing with citizens' need to revise certainties and strategies of knowledge in order to be better capable of adjusting decisions to new situations and of being receptive of others' experience." So what Urbinati is saying is that parliaments really are at this, this key interlocutor between citizens and the state, and they are an interlocutor that is able to analyze the discussion within society into democratic decision-making. So we'd like to talk now about what reasons for the expansion of Parliament's role. And I think the single biggest reason is responding to citizen expectations. So parliaments have long had this dyadic function that we talked about as chambers of debate and places of real decision-making. However, in what I would call the gentlemen's clubs of 19th century parliaments, thinking particularly about European parliaments, which typically had a restricted suffrage, so only a small proportion of men were able to vote, and also a context of the enforced deference to elites. Parliament's role was largely to enable elite bargaining and compromise. Now, mass suffrage and the rise of working class parties mass parties in the 20th century broadened the interests that were considered in debate and decision-making in parliaments. However, paradoxically, that feature, which was definitely a broadening of democracy, perhaps reduced the free interplay of ideas within parliaments, as interests tended to be represented as organized and disciplined blocks, leaving little room for informal exploration of issues. What we have seen in the late 20th century and now in the first 3 decades of the 21st century is the replacement of mass politics largely by the diversification of interests, shifting alliances, and demands for direct input into the policy process. So a very different relationship between citizens and parliament, between citizens and the policy process, the democratic process, than was the case in both the 19th century and in the first 4/5 of the 20th century. This change in dynamic has particularly given rise to a populist challenge. And I would argue that some of the core reasons, obviously, the rise of populism is an enormous topic. But in this context, I think the complexity of voice in contemporary society leads to frustration and alienation. So in the restricted suffrage parliaments of the 19th century, the legitimacy of decisions was buttressed by popular deference, deference to the established order, often deference to religious authorities. And in the bloc parliaments of the 20th century, of course, citizens tended to identify with one bloc or another, perhaps the socialist bloc or the Christian democratic bloc, and they saw their blocs being represented in parliament. And thus, they felt they had voice. They were part of the Christian Democratic Party, and they heard their leaders speaking and repeating the ideology and the beliefs of the Christian Democratic Party that they had signed up to, and the same with all the other mass parties. And this was the case, that voice was heard within Parliament, even if it was an opposition voice, as typically the socialist blocs were through much of the 20th century in most parliaments. But of course, in the diverse and fragmented 21st century arena, all voices are raised in a babel, but none are really heard. And so paradoxically, the flowering of multiple subject positions drives a desire for the simplistic mediation of populism. The babble that is heard is impossible for many people to understand and make sense of, and therefore provides an attractive, populism provides an attractive outlet. So how do parliaments respond to populism? So on the most direct level, Parliament's unique place as publicly accessible institutions of debate and decision-making should respond effectively to the populist claim that everything is decided in some secret elite cabal, some backdoor stitch-up, and that in which any democratic debate is simply a cover for something that has already been decided. So by opening the decision-making process at each stage, citizens are invited to provide their input throughout the policy cycle. An inclusion of dialogic processes through the policy cycle ensures input can be voiced in policy formulation, debate and adoption, monitoring of legislative and policy implementation, and in post-legislative scrutiny. So how have parliaments moved from a traditional to a full cycle approach? If we look at what I would say the traditional roles of parliament in the legislative process, they have always been very important. They have particularly focused on legislative scrutiny and adoption, so the scrutiny and adoption of laws, oversight of the executive, carried out more or less diligently, more or less effectively, and post facto audit, particularly budgetary audit. So how have parliaments expanded their engagement in the policy process? So they've moved from participation, as we saw in the last slide, at discrete parts of the policy cycle towards a full cycle engagement. And as I have said in the past, this engagement, the engagement at different points of the policy cycle, was not linked up. In other words, Parliament would pass a law, but would rarely revisit the legislation to see if it had been implemented and what were its impacts. Oversight was carried out, but was oversight linked to the legislation that Parliament itself had passed? Parliament's budget scrutiny and adoption role was also often superficial in the past, given the complexity of national budgeting. You know, all of you, I'm sure, at the Senate and in parliaments around the world think with horror of the volumes and volumes of the national budget that you are handed to look at, or not to look at, to study and to approve, thousands and thousands of pages that it's not realistic for an ordinary parliamentarian to review. So Parliament's, and then Parliament's post facto audit function focused mainly on formal compliance with budgetary envelopes rather than on the efficiency and efficacy of budget expenditures. So were the funds that Parliament had voted through the budget used in compliance with the budget lines or not, with much less attention paid to the efficiency, the impact of those budget expenditures. So the result of this was inability of Parliament to exercise effective scrutiny and oversight through in if you like, a closed cycle. Parliament would come in at different points in the cycle. These points were not connected. There were often long periods in between these points, and reference back was rarely made to the origin of the policy that was being implemented, the expenditures that were being made, which of course was the legislation scrutinized and passed by Parliament. So in response to that, parliaments have, and in different ways and around the world, have adopted a number of additional roles in the process. First of all, and I'm using here, tends to be a British term, but first of all, what Westminster calls green and white paper consultations. Secondly, and this is really consultations on ideas for legislation, ways to address policy challenges, green papers being less directive and white papers tending to propose a particular government version, a government proposal. And these papers form the basis of consultation with interest groups, with civil society, with citizens. Next, and there is an increasing use within governance generally of regulatory impact assessment. So before legislation is adopted, that the government in particular will will make strong efforts to analyze who and how people will be affected by the regulation, the legislation that's going to be passed. Legislative scrutiny, traditional part of parliamentary role, financial audit as previously, but expanded to include program impact audit. So the idea of auditing government expenditures has been expanded to include audit of the effectiveness, the impact of government expenditures. And then finally, post-legislative scrutiny, where legislation that has been passed is reviewed after a certain period of time to see how well it has worked, to put simply. I'll go into some details on each of these new aspects in a moment. So what are the reasons for expanded parliamentary engagement in the policy cycle? I've already mentioned a couple of them. I'd like to mention, first of all, a pushback against policy technicity, the idea that policies are so complicated that ordinary people and even ordinary parliaments can't possibly understand, and therefore need to take the word of the experts. Citizens' demand for voice and accountability, which I've already discussed in terms of this multiplication of citizen voices. Response to a very common criticism of parliaments that they are just rubber stamp institutions, that if one party has a majority, then it doesn't matter what piece of legislation is proposed, the majority will carry it. It doesn't matter what anybody else says or thinks, but what the quality of the legislation is. And I recall in my time when I worked in a senior role in the Canadian Parliament, a senior official at the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister's main advisor at the time, telling me that I was responsible for the engagement of MPs in the process, telling me, look, don't spend too much time on encouraging MPs to think, you know, parliaments only work if most of the MPs are just chocolate soldiers. So Parliament pushing back against that idea of being manipulated by the executive and just acting as a rubber stamp. As we've talked about already, greater emphasis on policy outcomes. Organized civil society has had an important impact. Civil society has become very effective at pushing parliaments and governments to respond to, take into account their issues and concerns. And then finally, which I'm again going to focus on in a bit more detail, burgeoning oversight institutions. So oversight institutions, independent oversight institutions have grown both in number and importance in capacity. And that growth has given Parliament independent sources of analysis and verification that they didn't have before. And again, my colleague Franklin, who spoke earlier, is not only an expert on post-legislative scrutiny, but also on the role of independent oversight institutions. So going into a little bit of details on the components of a full cycle approach. I talked already briefly about, first of all, pre-legislative consultations. So green papers being a starting point for discussion, describing an issue and outlining various approaches to deal with the issue. White papers proposing a single pathway and arguing for the type of policy initiative that the government would like to put into law. So in the classic Westminster process, a green paper followed by consultations, followed by a white paper, which will set out a pretty clear path and again sent out for consultation. So they're both a starting point for discussion. And when organized by parliaments, public input is solicited and is heard in public, And this draws back the veil of secrecy of executive policy development and discussion. As I also mentioned already, while the green and white paper approach is very much a Westminster tradition, many other parliaments, if not most democratic parliaments, engage in consultations based on discussion papers or outline legislative proposals. Okay. Next, an aspect that I think is important to discuss, but with some cautions, is regulatory impact assessment. Regulatory impact assessments are a growing feature of policy development globally, typically conducted by government, and they aim to assess the impact of proposed legislations and regulation. And it's essential that RIAs take into account the impacts of regulation on diverse and particularly on marginalized segments of the population who typically have little voice in the policy process. Now, from my perspective, regulatory impact assessments should be viewed as a tool for parliaments to make use of in the scrutiny process, rather than parliaments conducting them themselves. And I've seen some bad parliamentary, my business, as the kind introduction said, is working on the strengthening of parliaments around the world, particularly in emerging democracies. And I've seen some bad examples where parliamentary development programs have tried to get parliaments themselves to carry out regulatory impact assessments. And I feel that typically, there may be exceptions, but I haven't come across any, this is an absurdity. For example, if we want to talk about the impact of a particular environmental measure on the climate, Parliament is simply not equipped with the scientific tools to do that. And what is required is for government to carry out that work as part of the development of its green papers, its white papers, its directions for policy. And the role of Parliament should be, first of all, to establish the ways in which regulatory impact assessments are to be carried out, to make use, to analyze the regulatory impact assessments and feed that analysis, that comprehension of the RIAs into the legislative scrutiny, and particularly, as I mentioned already, ensuring that our regulatory impact assessments are inclusive and open to diverse constituencies, because obviously the impact of many, if not most, pieces of legislation varies greatly according to the particular constituency we're talking about. The third element I'd like to talk about is post-legislative scrutiny, and I would also add here evaluation of public policy. And I'm just going to skate quickly over this because we have some real experts in the field of post-legislative scrutiny with us. So PLS originated, I believe, and Franklin will correct me if I'm wrong, in the Westminster Parliament. And it's fundamental to the concept of the full cycle approach. We could say that PLS is what makes a full cycle approach necessary and important, because it ensures that parliaments don't simply adopt and then forget legislation. And the use of PLS is growing rapidly, both within and beyond Westminster-type parliaments. So sometimes it's argued that PLS is carried out mainly in Westminster-type parliaments, but I know from my very extensive work with the Ukrainian parliament that not only have they carried out post-legislative scrutiny for a number of years, but they have very recently, in fact, even while being in a state of war, greatly strengthened their PLS approach. So this is becoming a very, very broad topic. I was just on Friday and Saturday in Malawi working on a seminar on post-legislative scrutiny, on legislative scrutiny, and the interest and insistence, demand of the MPs in Malawi for post-legislative scrutiny showed how broadly this approach is being adopted and considered important. So PLS can be carried out in numerous ways, ranging from a relatively light implementation scan, like did the government actually implement the legislation, did it pass the necessary regulations, so on and so forth, to a much deeper, formally mandated, detailed follow-up on specific legislation. Now, obviously, the more in-depth the PLS approach, the more resources that would be consumed carrying it out, and therefore the fewer pieces of legislation that can be scrutinized. Therefore, good practice is for the requirement of PLS, the requirement for a mandatory review, to be included in the legislation when it's initially passed. So this legislation will be reviewed after 3 years, after 5 years. I didn't want to leave the field of post-legislative scrutiny until after I had mentioned evaluation of public policy, because as is often the case, there's something of a bifurcation of approaches to policy scrutiny, broadly speaking, between different types of parliaments. And in Francophone parliaments, the concept of evaluation of public policy tends to be preferred over the concept of post-legislative scrutiny. The idea of, so evaluation of public policy has similarities with PLS, but tends to focus on broader policy areas rather than a specific piece of legislation. PLS typically says, we will look at the Child Welfare Act after 5 years, whereas the evaluation of public policy may well focus on a broader question. What is the quality of child welfare services in this jurisdiction? Of course, including the legislative framework and how it's been implemented, but from the perspective of the policy rather than, or the policy area, rather than specifically the piece of relevant piece of legislation. Give some case studies of some new types of work that different parliaments, and I've just chosen 3 random parliaments that I happen to have done some work with or studied. So in the Republic of Georgia, in 2019, they adopted new rules of procedure that include regulatory impact assessment, again with my concern that there's a risk that they might be duplicating the work or trying to do the work that would be better done by government. Enhanced oversight and accountability tools and powers. They established a parliamentary budget office, which is a common way to enhance budgetary capacity, and they have also implemented post-legislative scrutiny. Second, talk about the Parliament of Scotland, which tends to be an innovating parliament, I think largely because it's quite a new parliament. And so unlike, say, Westminster or parliaments that have been around for hundreds of years, they are able to design their parliament and their parliamentary functions from a blank page. So they have institutionalized PLS through an audit and post-legislative scrutiny committee, although I heard in the seminar I was in Malawi that in fact they've moved to a slightly different model. So I'm sure that Franklin or other colleagues will be able to clarify any updates on that. And Scotland has also very, very intensively integrated public consultation throughout its parliamentary work. In South Africa, a key feature is the constitutionalization of independent institutions, what are called Chapter 9 institutions, institutions that are listed in Chapter 9 of the first democratic constitution of South Africa. And these institutions are all accountable to the National Assembly. So includes institutions, independent institutions that typically exist in other countries, Auditor General, an election commission, but also a Human Rights Commission, a Gender Equality Commission, a Commission on Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities. Furthermore, in South Africa, the necessity of public participation in legislative work has been constitutionalized, has been mandated. Following on a little bit on this question of independent institutions and full cycle parliamentary engagement, as I'm sure you know, I don't know anything about the internal cuisine of the Senate of Mexico, but typically most parliaments have very limited internal expert capacity. So a parliament, even quite a well-resourced parliament, might have 2 or 3 environmental experts, where a government may have 200 or 300, or possibly even 2,000 or 3,000. And this situation means that parliamentary engagement risks being superficial. But the emergence of independent oversight institutions frequently, and in my view, best reporting to Parliament, enable more effective parliamentary engagement. For example, most commonly, a Supreme Audit institution provides Parliament the independent information it needs to focus on key issues in budget execution. But as I mentioned in the case of South Africa, but it's the case in many other countries, independent oversight bodies are expanding to include other areas such as environment commissioners, independent human rights ombudspersons, etc. And typically these institutions are seen as politically independent and thus have the added advantage of increasing the credibility of parliamentary oversight. Citizens know that parliaments are political institutions, that what is being said by politicians is colored by their political perspectives and their orientation as pro-government or opposition. When independent institutions speak, they are typically, of course, if they're credible institutions, seen as reflecting a dispassionate and neutral view of the situation. I wanted to talk about one issue, which perhaps I should have put in the cautions section of the presentation, and that is on transnational governance and the full cycle parliament. And it's an issue that has concerned me for a number of years. I've been doing parliamentary strengthening practice for 20 plus years now, and I've seen this problem in many countries. So the devolution of authority, particularly in economic policy, to transnational institutions can really limit the scope for the intervention of parliaments. Of course, in the most developed transnational governance institution, the European Union has a democratic constitution, it has a European Parliament, and therefore the issue of usurpation of the role of national parliaments is counterbalanced by the existence of a directly elected democratic European Parliament. But most transnational bodies are expert and powerful government driven. So institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund typically quite strongly resist accountability to parliaments. Although their decisions, in fact, particularly in aid-dependent countries in crisis, may be as important as those of the National Finance Ministry. In fact, what the National Finance Ministry may say may well be largely determined by the decisions and the pressure and the conditionalities of international financial institutions. So full cycle parliamentary engagement, to be really full cycle, also needs to include the oversight of international agreements and commitments. Many, many times I have heard Finance Minister presenting budget to Parliament and saying, of course, we are obliged for this budget to contain this particular envelope because this is a commitment that we have made this is a commitment that we have made to the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank. And that basically means that Parliament can't say or do anything about it. I'd like to end the presentation talking about some cautions regarding a full cycle approach and or some limitations of a full cycle approach. First of all, in the full cycle approach, I presented it earlier in the presentation as being a bit of a response to populism, and now I want to knock that down a little bit, because engagement through the policy cycle, unfortunately, does not necessarily assure either enhanced democratic accountability or increased citizen satisfaction. I believe that engagement through the policy cycle is the right thing to do. It's the democratic thing to do. It can increase citizen satisfaction. But paradoxically, citizen engagement in the policy process, and you must have seen this yourself in your parliament and any parliament, paradoxically, engagement often fosters frustration, because multiple, in this era of if you like, the narrow casting of policy perspectives with multiple diverse points of view, people who have taken the time to engage in policy process frequently don't see their perspective recognized in policy outcomes. And that's the difference from the era of bloc politics of the 20th century, where people subscribe to a fairly coherent ideological perspective, and they always could see that in the policy process. I might go as a hairdresser to talk about safety in the workplace to Parliament and not see anything to do with hairdressers and safety in hairdressers' salons in the legislation on workplace safety that comes out. And the risk is that I think, well, they just didn't listen to me at all. And there is very little research on if and how citizen engagement changes policy outcomes. And populists are often quite effective, I have found, in attacking the architecture of consultation and engagement as both wasteful and particularly as dominated by special interests. So engagement, of course, gives the opportunity for diverse voices to be heard. Some of those voices are scandalous to other parts of the population, and so the whole process risks being tarred by populists as being some kind of what is often said these days in Europe, a woke conspiracy to force, for example, different perspectives on gender to traditional perspectives, so on and so forth. And actually Montesquieu talked about the second issue I wanted to address, which is the danger of parliamentary usurpation of powers. So Montesquieu says in every government there are three sorts of powers: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And he tries to make very clear, or he makes very clear in this quote, that when legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body, that is a genuine risk to liberty. So one thing that I think it's important to say is that full cycle policy engagement does not mean Parliament's taking on the role of the executive in implementing programs. So, as I said, Parliament full cycle engagement does not mean that Parliament should be duplicating the executive or playing the role of judiciary. It should not be establishing parallel judicial processes, should not be engaged in doing the work of the executive. Parliament's core functions remain legislation, oversight, representation, and voting the budget. Parliament's, and a final point here is that Parliament's ambitions in full cycle engagement need to be tailored to resources and capacity. The worst thing in the world is for parliaments to attempt to engage at various points in the policy process and to be able to do so in a credible and effective way. And typically what that means from my point of view, that I'm interested in the perspective of others, of you in Mexico and everywhere, typically that means parliaments selecting the areas in which they're involved in the full cycle. It may not be necessary, it may not be useful for parliaments to carry out post-legislative scrutiny about a technical piece of legislation regarding the definition of sizes of washers or parts, metal parts. This will be important for the industry, but it's not probably something that requires the engagement of a parliament with limited resources. So that's the end of my presentation. I thank you very, very much for listening to me, and I'm around to answer questions and engage in debate with you. Thanks.
Dear Jonathan, thank you very much for your conference. Yes, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And of course, we have a couple of questions about your presentation. You be able to.
Hello, thank you very much, Jonathan. It was very insightful for us to listen to this. While I was reading your theory of this full cycle approach, I was wondering if it will be possible to incorporate this in a legislative theory and make a shift from the legislative process towards a legislative cycle. So this will engage and make legislators being liable of the results of what they propose. So to me, I think this could initiate, for example, in our case, by a shift in theory towards a full cycle, as a full cycle instead of a process. What do you think about this?
No, I agree. My paper was designed to make that argument exactly. And I agree that I think this is an approach that should be encouraged as a way of thinking about the work of parliaments. I just have this one caution about, which I mentioned at the end, which is that parliaments do have limited resources. And I think that they will always need to pick and choose the ways they are involved in the full cycle, and particularly, obviously, to focus on the most socially and economically important pieces of legislation, and make sure that they spend time throughout the cycle, from the beginning of the cycle in gathering different perspectives, citizen input, through to the end of the cycle, looking at post-legislative scrutiny, how that piece of legislation worked out, and then feeding into any revisions that are needed. So I think overall, parliamentarians should think of their work as part of a full cycle, and not just a bunch of different places. Today is the budget debate. I'm going to say what I think about the budget, and then disconnected to that, the comments or interventions that I might make on a particular policy issue, to really think, how do these things join together? And that makes parliaments more effective. So thanks very much for the question and suggestion. I agree completely.
So would you think it would be theoretically accurate to change the term process towards full cycle, or?
Well, that would be fantastic. I think I suspect that greater minds than me ought to be involved in that discussion. So from my perspective, I put that forward as a good idea, and I think it should be put up for discussion and debate, which is one of the reasons that I published the the article in Journal of Legislative Studies.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Second questions will be which, at your concern, which organism or institution, internal or external to the Parliament, would be responsible to the parliamentary full cycle engagement, and which will be its function, at your opinion?
Well, I think if it's a function that Parliament is to carry out, then I think it should be in the responsibility to carry out that function should be internal. What is necessary to move towards full cycle engagement in any way is typically for the new or the additional roles to be incorporated within the rules of procedure, the internal regulations of the Parliament. Every Parliament has different models for that. And in terms of a body to be established to ensure a full cycle approach, I'm not sure that I'm not necessarily in favor of establishing. This is my first thinking. I haven't really thought through the pros and cons. Not necessarily in favor of establishing new bodies within Parliament. I think it would be better to incorporate this full cycle approach into the responsibilities of the existing structures of Parliament, into the responsibilities of the committees, into the responsibility of the administration, and therefore have the full cycle approach organically part of the work of Parliament, rather than sort of setting it aside. In some parliaments, just talking about post-legislative scrutiny as part of a full cycle approach, in some parliaments that post-legislative scrutiny is delegated to a particular body. I believe in the French Senate, for example, it's an advisor to the president of the Senate. I think that's probably a very efficient way of doing things. Of course, it's not a very inclusive way of doing things. And it may well be for that reason that I understand the Scottish Parliament has moved away from having a specific scrutiny committee, if I understood correctly what I learned on the weekend, towards incorporating that full cycle responsibility into the work of all the parliamentary committees. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Jonathan. I don't know if there are some questions now. There are?
There's some other question about this that you were mentioning about citizen engagement. If there are any successful examples, or do you envision any way to have a successful engagement?
Well, I think almost every parliament seeks to enhance citizen engagement, and it's, you know, when we talk with the emerging democracy parliaments we work with, we have about 15 partnerships going on at any one time between emerging democracy parliaments and the different national parliaments of the European Union. I would say in 75% of the cases, parliaments are prioritizing citizen engagement and are wanting support and help and encouragement to do so. What I would highly recommend, and I can put it in the chat, is that there's a very, very active and very successful international network on parliamentary engagement called IPEN, International Parliament. I think it's called Parliamentary Engagement Network, and it's led by a leading Portuguese-British scholar. It has engagement from across the world, including very much from the Americas, and I think that's a great place to exchange sort of best practices and ideas, and I'll put that in the chat.
Jonathan? Oh, yes, thank you very much. I guess give you an applause for your presentation and, of course, the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we pass with the next conference of the